to us. We are not recipients. And we are not going to justify why we need to change the world which was built on slave mentality. We are not going to beg anybody to understand why, after years of colonialism, we want to reset the world. Whether they understand or not is their business. 1.4 billion people on this continent and in the diaspora need to build a new world which answers to their development needs and aspirations. And there can be no compromise on this matter. Finish.
Africa is constantly described as a problem that needs fixing. Too poor, too unstable, too corrupt, too dependent. But what if Africa is not broken at all? What if Africa entered a world that was already designed before it was even allowed to exist as a political entity? What if the rules of money, power, borders, and development were written at a time when Africa was still legally owned, still managed, still classified as territory instead of participant? Why do African countries follow global rules yet remain permanently indebted? Why are African resources everywhere in the world except in African balance sheets? Why do European museums still store African remains like cultural trophies? And if Africa cannot colonize anyone, cannot enslave anyone, cannot steal from anyone, how exactly is it supposed to develop? These questions point to something far deeper than leadership or policy. They point to a hidden structure that shapes Africa's reality from the outside. And Kwesi Pratt has answers. Let's talk about it in detail.
We were seen as part of the colonial enterprise of Britain and so on. So we were not at the table when the UN was being created. We were not at the table where institutions of the UN, like the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, and all of those were being created. We must insist on being at the table, and we must insist that these institutions serve African interests. That is part of the process of reparation.
Kwesi Pratt is right. Africa did not arrive late to the modern world. Africa arrived in a world that was already finished. When the United Nations was created, when the World Bank and IMF were designed, when the basic rules of global trade were written, Africa was not sitting in those rooms, because Africa did not legally exist as a sovereign territory. Entire populations were still classified as colonial subjects. Their land was still owned by European empires. Their borders were still administrative tools of control, not expressions of political will. So the most important decisions in human history, how money moves, how debt works, how development is measured, how power is distributed, were made while Africa was still property. This is the detail most people never think about. African states did not help design the global system. They inherited it, and they inherited it at the bottom. So when African countries became independent, they did not build new systems. They were plugged into existing ones. They adopted foreign constitutions, foreign currencies, foreign development models, foreign economic theories, foreign institutions, all designed for a world where Africa's role was already defined: supplier of raw materials, consumer of finished products, borrower of foreign capital, follower of external rules. That is why African economies often feel like they are running endlessly without arriving anywhere. Growth without power, participation without influence, reform without transformation. You can change presidents, rewrite policies, sign new agreements, but the underlying architecture remains untouched. The same trade routes, the same financial structures, the same development logic, the same dependency patterns. Africa was never allowed to design its own operating system. It was forced to run by someone else. This is also why global institutions always appear neutral while producing unequal outcomes. The World Bank does not openly say it exists to manage African resources. The IMF does not declare that its policies will keep Africa indebted. The WTO does not advertise that its rules favor industrial powers. But neutrality does not mean fairness. It means the rules were written so long ago that their bias now feels invisible. Africa entered a world where success was already defined in ways that Africa structurally cannot achieve. Industrialization requires capital. Capital requires control over finance. Finance requires monetary sovereignty. Monetary sovereignty requires currencies that you can issue and regulate. Africa does not control the main currencies it uses, so it must borrow them. And once you borrow the currency that defines the system, you no longer control the system. You serve it. This is the silent trap. Africa is not poor because it lacks intelligence, ambition, or resources. Africa is poor because it operates within a global design that extracts value upward. The system rewards those who created it and disciplines those who joined it later. Which means African independence was never the end of colonialism. It was the rebranding of colonialism into institutions. No armies needed, no chains required, just contracts, loans, policies, and best practices. Power became technical instead of violent, invisible instead of obvious, structural instead of personal. Africa is not failing the global system. Africa is performing exactly the role the system assigned to it. And once you realize that Africa was absent at the moment the world decided how it would function, a disturbing thought appears. If Africa never helped design the system, then maybe the system itself was never meant to serve Africa at all. But if Africa was excluded when the world wrote its rules, then who exactly wrote Africa's story? And why is Europe still preserving Africa's dead like trophies instead of evidence?
You go to France, you go to Germany, and so on. Some of the things on display are the heads of our heroes. The heads of our heroes are on display. How did they come by the heads of these heroes? These are the people who resisted the transatlantic slave trade. These are the people who resisted colonialism, who were killed, who were assassinated, and their heads taken as trophies and deposited in those countries and in their museums. The existence of those heads tells the story of our resistance, and our resistance was massive, it was fierce, and our resistance led not just to the abolition of the slave trade, but our resistance gave birth to concepts of Pan-Africanism. Our resistance gave birth to the fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester. Our resistance gave birth to the independence movement, and we will continue this struggle, this battle, until final victory.
European museums are often presented as places of knowledge, culture, and memory. They claim to preserve history so humanity can learn from it. But when you look closely at what is actually inside many of these museums, a far darker story emerges. The skulls of African resistance leaders are not educational artifacts. They are evidence of violence that was never resolved. These were not random individuals. They were kings, generals, spiritual leaders, warriors, and organizers who resisted slave raids, colonial armies, forced labor systems, land theft, and economic domination. They were hunted, captured, executed, decapitated, and transported across continents. Their bodies were not returned to their communities. They were archived, cataloged, and displayed as objects. This was not just a conquest, it was psychological warfare. Killing resistance is one form of power. Displaying resistance is another. It sends a message that goes beyond death. Even your defiance belongs to us. Even your identity will be preserved on our terms. Even your memory will be curated by the people who destroyed you. And the most disturbing part is how normalized this has become. School children walk past these remains. Tourists take photos. Academics write papers. Gift shops sell souvenirs. No global outrage. No international trials. No serious demand for accountability. What would be considered a war crime in any other context is treated as cultural heritage. But these skulls accidentally expose something the official history tries to hide. Africa was never passive. Africa did not simply fall to colonialism. It fought, fiercely, repeatedly, across centuries, across regions, across empires. Every colony required military campaigns. Every plantation required suppression. Every trade route required force. Pan-Africanism did not emerge from political theory or university debates. It emerged from shared trauma, from chains, from exile, from shipholds, from mass displacement, from the realization that Africans were being attacked as a collective, not as separate tribes or nations. Unity was not ideological. It was a survival strategy. That is why European museums are so revealing. They do not display African obedience. They display African resistance. They prove that colonialism was never a civilizing mission. It was a war. And the trophies of that war are still on display, which creates a deep contradiction in the global narrative. If Africa resisted so violently, if colonialism required such sustained force, if millions were killed and entire societies were shattered, then how did the world convince itself that slavery and colonialism are finished chapters? Because the visible violence ended, but the structure that replaced it remained. The guns were lowered, the flags were changed, the administrators left. But the systems of control evolved into contracts, institutions, and global rules. What used to be enforced by soldiers is now enforced by policies. What used to be imposed by force is now imposed by law. So the museums tell one story on the surface, but a much more dangerous one underneath. They show that Africa's defeat was never total. Resistance never ended. It simply lost visibility. The battlefield moved from land to finance, from armies to institutions, from violence to neutral systems, which leads to the uncomfortable realization: if Africa is still structurally constrained, but no longer visibly enslaved, then perhaps the chains were not removed at all. They were just made invisible.
Not only the Europeans who enslaved us, there were other nationalities which enslaved us and so on. And perhaps why are we not focusing attention on all of our history of slavery and so on and so forth? I think that's a legitimate question, but there's a problem. We cannot assume today that the slavery, the colonialism and so on has come to an end. It has not come to an end. We are still being enslaved, we are still being colonized, our resources are still being stolen.
This is where Kwesi Pratt tells us the uncomfortable parts of this story, because it forces a separation between history and reality. It is easy to talk about slavery and colonialism as events that happened in the past, as chapters that ended, as crimes that were eventually corrected by independence and modern law. That narrative is comforting because it suggests the problem has already been solved. It allows the world to say, yes, terrible things happen, but they are over now. And once something is declared over, responsibility disappears with it. But Pratt's point cuts straight through that illusion. The question of who enslaved Africa in the past is not the real issue anymore. The real issue is whether Africa is still being exploited in the present. Because if the same flow of wealth continues, if the same patterns of extraction remain, if the same power imbalance exists, then the system has not ended. It has simply learned how to hide. Slavery did not collapse, it upgraded. The old system required ships, chains, plantations, and overseers. The new system requires banks, contracts, trade agreements, debt structures, and corporate law. Instead of owning bodies, it controls economies. Instead of forcing labor, it designs conditions where labor has no alternatives. Instead of auctions, it uses markets. Instead of whips, it uses interest rates. Africa still sends out raw materials: oil, gold, cobalt, lithium, cocoa, timber, and rare earth minerals. And it still receives finished products, technology, pharmaceuticals, machinery, software, and financial services. The value is created elsewhere. The profit is booked elsewhere. The intellectual ownership belongs elsewhere. Africa supplies the inputs, but rarely owns the outcomes. Even debt follows the same logic. African countries borrow foreign currencies to fund development, but they cannot create those currencies, so they must export real resources to repay abstract money. That means physical wealth is constantly flowing outward to service financial systems that Africa does not control. It is a transfer that never reverses. This is why debates about who else participated in slavery become a distraction. Yes, multiple groups were involved historically, but only one system transformed slavery into a permanent global economic structure. Only one system industrialized it, legalized it, normalized it, and then renamed it development. What makes this even more dangerous is that the new system does not look like oppression. It looks technical, it looks bureaucratic, it looks neutral. It is presented as economics, not exploitation, as policy, not power, as a necessity, not a design. So Africa is told it is free, while operating inside rules it did not create, currencies it does not control, trade systems that disadvantage it, and financial institutions that discipline it. The chains are gone, but the movement is still restricted. The empire is gone, but the hierarchy remains. And this creates a paradox no civilization has faced before. Africa is still being extracted from, but cannot extract from anyone else in return. It remains inside a global machine that requires exploitation to function, yet it has no external population to exploit. Which means Africa is expected to develop using a model that historically only works through theft without being allowed to steal. And that leads to the question that destabilizes everything that comes next. If Africa cannot colonize, enslave, or drain others like every dominant power before it, then what kind of development path is even possible? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel. You're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement.
As Africans,
Let's continue.
The example of Britain. Which country are we going to colonize? Which people are we going to enslave? Which resources are we going to steal? That option is not available to us as Africans. The option of enslaving others is not available to us. The option of stealing resources from other places is not available to us. The only option that is available to the African people for their development is collective self-reliance.
Every powerful society that came before built its wealth by draining someone else. Europe colonized entire continents. The Americas enslaved millions. Empires expanded through conquest, occupation, and forced extraction. Prosperity was never created in isolation. It was accumulated through external suffering. Africa does not have that option. There is no foreign population for Africa to exploit, no colonies to strip, no external labor pool to drain, no distant lands to conquer, which means Africa is the first civilization that must attempt development without theft as its engine, not as an ethical choice but as a structural reality. The historical method that produced modern wealth everywhere else is simply unavailable. This makes Africa's development problem completely unprecedented. It cannot follow the European path, because that path was built on an empire. It cannot follow the American path, because that path was built on slavery and land theft. It cannot even follow the emerging powers, because most of them built strength through internal control combined with external leverage. Africa must grow purely from within itself. That means value must be created internally rather than extracted externally. Resources must be processed locally instead of exported raw. Markets must be connected regionally instead of oriented outward. Infrastructure must link African economies to each other instead of feeding foreign supply chains. Development must come from continental integration, not isolated national strategies. This is why national solutions repeatedly fail. African borders were never designed to function as independent economic units. They were drawn for administrative convenience by colonial powers, not for industrial logic. They split natural markets, divided cultural regions, separated supply chains, and fragmented labor pools. What looks like diversity on a map is actually economic dismemberment. Currencies follow the same pattern. Many African states do not control their monetary systems. Their exchange rates, reserves, and financial policies are influenced or constrained by external institutions. That means even when African countries want to industrialize, they struggle to finance it without external permission. Growth becomes conditional. Sovereignty becomes symbolic. So Africa is trapped inside a structure where every part of the system discourages self-sufficiency. Trade routes point outward. Finance flows outward. Investment incentives favor foreign extraction over local transformation. Even development projects are often designed to integrate Africa deeper into global supply chains rather than build independent production capacity. This creates a tragic contradiction. Africa needs unity to develop, but operates inside divisions that were designed to prevent unity. It needs internal markets, but is forced to prioritize external ones. It needs industrial coordination, but is trapped in fragmented political units. Which means Africa is not failing because it lacks ideas. It is failing because it is trying to build a new civilization inside a political form that was never meant to allow one. The continent is attempting to create collective power while confined within structures built for collective weakness. And that leads to a deeper realization. Africa's biggest obstacle is not its leaders, its culture, or its people. It is the artificial framework inherited from colonialism that still defines how Africa is allowed to exist. If Africa's political and economic structure itself was designed to prevent real unity and power, then what is truly keeping the continent locked inside underdevelopment? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. At this point, the story usually takes an easy turn. Corruption becomes the explanation. Bad leadership becomes the villain. Weak institutions become the diagnosis. These answers are comforting because they keep the problem internal. They allow the world to say Africa is responsible for its own condition. Fix the leaders, fix the policies, fix the mindset, and everything will improve. But this explanation collapses under serious examination. Corruption exists in every region on Earth. Powerful countries hide it behind corporate structures, lobbying systems, and legal loopholes. Yet corruption alone does not determine global position. No amount of honesty can transform a structurally subordinate economy into a dominant one if the system itself is stacked against it. Africa's real problem is not moral, it is positional. Africa occupies the lowest level of a global hierarchy where technology is imported, capital is external, currencies are controlled elsewhere, and even success depends on foreign approval. African countries can produce a surplus and still lose, because the terms of trade favor industrial powers. They can grow their GDP and still become more indebted, because growth is financed through borrowed currencies. They can attract investment and still lose wealth, because profits are repatriated. This is not a failure of leadership, it is a failure of the environment. Even the most visionary African leader inherits a structure where development requires permission. Loans from foreign institutions, access to foreign markets, ratings from foreign agencies, validation from foreign investors. You cannot achieve true sovereignty inside a system where the basic conditions of survival are controlled externally. This is why political change rarely produces economic transformation. Governments rotate, constitutions are rewritten, parties collapse and reform, but the underlying mechanics remain the same. Africa remains locked into exporting raw materials, importing finished goods, servicing foreign debt, and complying with global policies it did not design. It creates a surreal situation. African states appear independent on paper but function like franchises in a global corporate order. Flags exist, anthems play, elections happen. But financial power, industrial control, technological dominance, and narrative authority sit elsewhere. This is what makes the structure so powerful. It does not look like a prison. It looks like participation. Africa is included in the global economy, but in a role that guarantees dependency. The system does not exclude Africa. It incorporates Africa as a subordinate component, which means Africa is not struggling because it lacks solutions. It is struggling because the solutions available to it are defined by the very system that benefits from its weakness. You cannot reform your way out of a design that profits from your position. You cannot negotiate your way into power inside a structure that depends on you being powerless. You cannot develop using rules written to extract from you. This is why corruption is a distraction. It personalizes a fundamentally systemic problem. It turns architecture into behavior. It makes Africa look broken instead of revealing that the environment is engineered. Africa does not suffer from too many bad leaders. Africa suffers from a global system where leadership operates inside boundaries that cannot produce autonomy. And once that becomes clear, a final unavoidable realization appears. If the structure itself is the prison, then freedom cannot come from reforms inside it. It must come from changing the structure itself. If Africa cannot escape underdevelopment by reforming the system, then what kind of revolution is actually required to break free? The kind of revolution Africa needs is not the kind that makes headlines. It is not a coup, not a protest wave, not a change of presidents, not a new constitution, not even a new ideology. Because all of those operate inside the system. And the system itself is the problem. Africa does not need emotional liberation. It needs infrastructural liberation. Real power in the modern world is not held by flags or armies. It is held by whoever controls finance, technology, data, logistics, energy, production, and narrative. Whoever owns the systems that make reality function controls the future. Everything else is decoration. Africa today does not control its monetary systems. It does not control the platforms through which its data flows. It does not control the technology that defines productivity. It does not control the industrial chains that turn raw material into value. It does not control the financial instruments that shape investment. It does not control the stories that define how the world perceives it. So Africa exists inside systems it does not own, operates economies it does not command, and measures success using metrics designed elsewhere. That is why independence feels hollow. Because sovereignty without system control is symbolic. You can vote inside a system you do not own. You can legislate inside structures you do not design. You can lead inside mechanisms that limit your power. The real revolution is not political. It is structural ownership. Who controls African currencies? Who owns African supply chains? Who builds African digital infrastructure? Who processes African resources? Who sets African trade rules? Who defines African knowledge systems? Until Africa answers those questions with Africa, nothing else matters. This is why the future is so dangerous right now. The old Western order is weakening. New powers are rising. New alliances are forming. New financial systems are emerging. On the surface, it looks like an opportunity, but beneath it lies a trap. Africa could easily replace Western dependence with Eastern dependence and call it multipolarity. New partners, new loans, new trade deals, new investments, same structure, same position, same extraction, different accents. That is not liberation. That is rebranding. True African freedom means building systems that serve Africa first, not renting access to systems owned by others. It means continental financial institutions, not foreign credit. African industrial platforms, not export dependency. African technology ecosystems, not imported solutions. African knowledge production, not borrowed narratives. It means Africa must stop thinking in terms of nations and start thinking in terms of civilization. Because the modern world is organized around civilizational platforms, not countries, not identities, systems, and Africa has never built one of its own. This is why the struggle is so deep. It is not about dignity. It is about control. It is not about recognition. It is about infrastructure. It is not about history. It is about future architecture. Africa does not need to be included. It needs to be built. And the final truth is this: Africa will not be saved by anyone. Not the West, not the East, not allies, not investors, not institutions. Africa will only become free the day it stops renting reality and starts manufacturing it. So, let us know in the comment section. Will Africa finally create its own systems of power, or spend the next century choosing which empire to depend on? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.